A highly informative keynote presentation by Dr. Ingersoll to help us better understand how we can address rural teacher shortages. But in all of the local media and press, what often gets left out of the conversation is the issue of principal turnover. And so a 2017 national survey of public school principals found that approximately 18% of principals had left their position since the year prior. And like with teachers, certain schools face more specific challenges with their principals' retention than others. That same year in high poverty schools, particularly in urban and rural environments, turnover rate was 21%. So you might ask the question, well, why does this matter? Well, research has suggested that when principals turn over, teachers often turn over as well. And this instability hurts student learning gains. And there's a lot of research talking about, well, why might that be? There's issues that relate to trust, like if a student doesn't feel like they have a stable body of teachers to confide in, because you see a rotating parade of faces that keeps happening, and then what is that going to do to the school environment? What does that do to the motivation of the students? Today, we're going to continue our seminar on rural talent management by addressing not only recruitment and retention of teachers, but also principals as well. And we're going to start with a presentation on teacher labor markets by Dr. Goff. Dr. Peter Goff is assistant professor at the Education Leadership and Policy and Analysis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He studies issues related to data use and decision-making, particularly with respect to strategic management of human resources. Dr. Goff's particular research areas examine teacher assignment practices, the impact of within-school mobility on instructional growth, differential selection by gender and race in the leadership labor market, teacher school matching, and quantifying educator labor supply. Dr. Goff will present the role of place labor market dynamics in the rural and non-rural school districts. Without any further ado, Dr. Peter Goff.
Thanks, Evan. So if there's anything that shows up in the presentation that I know ahead of time, there's a couple slides where the font's going to be small. If you want me to point that out, let me know. So in the media, we see this idea of teacher shortages kind of propagated all the time. Here's a couple examples across Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, California, Maryland, Idaho, and in my state of Wisconsin, attributing teacher shortage to payback for anti-teacher attitudes. Private companies are trying to fulfill the teacher shortage, profiteering, and so on and so forth. One of the things that's come up in Wisconsin is that this conversation has moved into the legislature, and some of the folks are trying to find solutions. They're hearing about this labor shortage, this teacher shortage, and they're proposing potential solutions, potentially solutions that could deprofessionalize education, like removing licensure requirements. In some cases altogether, which ultimately didn't end up getting passed. As part of that conversation, I think it's interesting and noteworthy to point out, when you hear the term teacher shortage, as a profession, as a collective, we don't actually have a definition for what a teacher shortage is, when we have one, when we've moved out of one. So without that metric, hearing claims of teacher shortage, I think you should always put with a little bit of an asterisk next to your head. But nonetheless, here's an example where we have claims of a teacher shortage, particularly claims of a teacher shortage in rural schools that's being used as motivation to put forward legislation and policy change. So in rural schools, nationally, we see that roughly half of our districts, over half of our districts, about 7,000 of them are rural. And we have 1 in 6 of our children are educated in rural districts. And that these opportunities to learn in the rural context are different. They're different in fundamental ways than they are in other contexts, particularly the types of classes that they can take tends to be limited, is just one example. And oftentimes when we talk about rural, it's from an urban-centric context. So just defining rural and thinking about what is rural can be a very complicated question. NCES, the National Center for Education Statistics, provides information on measures of rurality using the US Census. And it is an urban-centric definition. It's sort of how far these districts are from what's referred to as an urban center. And we can classify districts in terms of urban, suburban, town, and rural. And then it offers classifications within each of those groups that we can further break that down. For example, rural is broken down into rural fringe, rural distant, and rural remote. And those rural fringe districts are actually very close. They only have to be 2.5 miles away from an urban center. So if you think about where I live in Madison, I can drive 15 minutes and be on a farm and it's rural. It's legitimately, and it's classified as rural, but it's also 15 minutes away from downtown Madison, which is a different kind of rural than the remote rural that you get where, you know, you can drive for 40 minutes, you don't have Wi-Fi, right? Everything's very, very diverse, or sorry, very, very sparse. I was actually, one of the folks I was working with on this paper is from rural Wisconsin. He suggested that perhaps a better measure of rurality should be the distance to the closest Piggly Wiggly.
Oh.
And I don't know if you have those here.
Yes.
You have those? Okay, all right. But that was her call. She thought that would be the way to go. Urban contexts present unique challenges in education. They have poverty just like urban contexts do, but it tends to manifest in different ways. The sparsity tends to be a unique and defining feature of rural context that presents particular challenges. When we think about diversity within rural context, particularly diversifying the teacher labor force, that's a perennial challenge. In staffing these schools, as Richard mentioned yesterday, is hard. It's a source of concern. When we think about staffing and labor dynamics, we know that teacher labor markets tend to be fairly small. Novice teachers usually accept positions within about 15 miles of their hometowns or graduate universities. More recent research has found that the student teaching placement is a significant predictor, more so than hometowns or graduate universities, for determining where a teacher is going to end up. So we're going to end up coming back to that point later. We see that rural schools tend to employ higher percentages of first-year teachers. Typically, these are teachers that they need a job, right? They just graduated, they need a job, they go to a rural context who needs teachers. But what we see is their attrition rate of novice teachers tends to be much higher, and people then, once they have a job and they can search for a job, when they can find a non-rural position, they tend to take it. That's another point we'll return to in the data as well. Most of what we know about labor markets tends to come from annual data, so we know where somebody worked in one year, and then where they worked in the next year, and then from that we can look at mobility trends and so on and so forth. And we can learn quite a bit from that, but as anybody who's been on the job market knows, that obscures a huge amount of frenetic motion and self-sorting in the application process and the hiring process and the interviews and so forth that goes on behind the scenes. Throughout this process, leadership is key, both for recruiting teachers and for retaining them, and managing that whole hiring process. So in rural schools, we see that oftentimes we have close ties amongst faculty, between faculty and students, between faculty and school leadership. And some of the essential features of leadership are, we see instructional learning, bridging and buffering, community engagement, ensuring the safe learning environment, and of course human capital management. These are the sort of ubiquitous features of leadership, regardless of context, but how these features manifest within rural schools is different. And we don't know much about it. It's one of the things that we've been having conversations with in our working group in the past few days, trying to dig into that and figure out how we can explore that space. Ultimately, leaders can't hire, they can't solve their staffing problems, they can't engage in the hiring process if people aren't applying to their schools. So that's where this research starts, looking at the applicant pools across contexts and how teachers engage the labor market. So this work is in partnership with the Department of Public Instruction and WECAN, the Wisconsin Educator Career Access Network, which is an application portal. It's a statewide system where people can apply for jobs and districts can post vacancies. So we use that system to ask and merge it in with the DPI data, the Department of Public Instruction staffing data, to address these questions. First, what are the characteristics of teachers who apply to rural districts, and how do these differ across locales and contexts? And two, how do applicant pools in rural districts compare to those of non-rural districts? So the data in context. So again, I'm looking at applications to teaching vacancies in Wisconsin. The data has about 5,000 vacancies, and these are vacancies that are posted at the district level, so they're not specifically associated with this school. although they may be in a description. One vacancy posting could be used to hire multiple teachers. So if you wanted to put a posting out for an elementary school teacher, that could be used to hire 2 or 3 elementary school teachers if that was your need. And the district sample represents about 83% of all of Wisconsin's teaching positions. We capture a good deal of the state particular sample. We've got 14,000 applicants that submitted almost 200,000 applications. So we take all this application data, and again, we merge that in with the DPI data, the staffing data, to incorporate information such as gender and race and where they taught previously, which is obviously not incorporated into application data. Throughout this work, we use what's called job choice theory, and job choice theory examines the preferences of teachers as they engage the labor market through objective, subjective, and critical contact perspectives. And the objective ways that you can look at the labor market is by salary, student population, and local wealth. And I think this is a particular concern of mine because we think about all of the metrics that we've used to allow people to examine and get to know public schools, right? We have all these metrics that are used for accountability purposes, right? So the federal government can look at schools and examine them and compare them. Many districts have metrics that allow parents to help choose between schools, so parents can make informed decisions about where their kids go. What we don't have is any sort of system at all that gives teachers information about schools that helps them engage the labor market. So these objective measures really don't exist for teachers unless they would go digging for them from a system that was meant to provide other information, like accountability information, parent information, and so forth. So the information from economic theory, we think labor markets work perfectly when you have perfect information. Here's an instance where teachers have very limited information on where they're going to go to school, and they have to rely on their professional networks. That obviously is a problem for novice teachers who have very constrained professional networks. So the information they have available to them to make informed choices on their schools is therefore limited. The last point, so subjective deals with leadership support, school climate, and collegiality, and these are largely invisible to teachers, particularly novice teachers. Critical contact perspective doesn't happen, right, involves interaction with recruiters, faculty, and staff, and these things don't happen until the applicant gets to actually interact with that particular school. So that doesn't happen unless they get, right, an interview offer often. So they don't even have access to that information until further on down the line, until they can move through the selection process. Some of the measures that we're using in this, to measure rurality, I use the NCS locale codes, urban, suburban, town, and rural. And as I mentioned, measuring rural can be tricky. It can be difficult, problematic. One of the ways that I wanted to see it is this measure actually capturing rurality in Wisconsin? I compared it to the districts that receive sparsity aid from the state based on the population density of their school district. And 54% of the districts that are classified as rural did receive sparsity aid. The district that received transportation aid, so they spend a significant portion of their budget on transportation, busing the students in and out. 86% of those were classified as rural by NCES. And one of the other problems that tends to plague rural districts is declining enrollment. And 82% of the districts in the 90th percentile of declining enrollment were also classified as rural under this. So that gave me some confidence that although it's an imperfect measure, the measure of rurality from NCES, at least for Wisconsin, seems to be appropriate. So to answer research question 1, I use this analytic model. I can give you a brief overview of what this was, but I do like Richard's approach yesterday when he said, okay, we're gonna put the data into the magic stats box and then go and show you the results. I did want to point out one thing that'll come up though, and that's here with demographics, gender and race, and locale of prior teaching position. So one of the features of the data is that when people apply, they include their DPI staffing ID number in the application database. Now for some novice teachers and for out-of-state applicants, they might not have that number yet as they're going through the licensure process and it will be assigned. So not everybody in the application database can be matched with somebody in the DPI staffing database. Right? For novice teachers, they didn't have a prior teaching position by definition. And that means we're going to be missing some of the gender and the demographic information, gender and race. So I'll talk about how we handled that by basically running a couple models with and without that information. And then for research question 2, we have, which looks at the number of applications in a particular district. So just to, I'm going to go back to this one quickly. The outcome for research question 1 is the proportion of applications that an applicant sent to a rural locale. So we're looking at behaviors of teachers on the market and how likely are they to seek out employment in a rural context. Again, getting to this idea that principals can't hire people that don't apply, right? So looking at the people who are at least interested in teaching in a rural context. The second research question shifts the level of analysis to districts. So the second research question looks at the total number of applications in a district's applicant pool. So who are they choosing amongst for a given position to fill a particular vacancy? And for that, we look at the independent variables of locale, measures of supply that I'll come back to, high, medium, and low supply, and then measures of the district context, including distance to the educator preparation program. So just descriptively, within Wisconsin, we have roughly 34 districts are classified as city, 70 suburb, 96 town, and the majority of them are classified as rural, 263. And our sample for the analytic sample for our data largely mirrors those proportions. If you're familiar with Wisconsin, here's a couple of the districts that are up there. One thing that might jump to mind is we have 34 LEAs classified as cities or urban. Now, if you know anything about Wisconsin, you can probably name 2, right? You got Madison, you got Milwaukee. Familiar with a little football, maybe throw out Green Bay, and then after that, things start to get really sketchy, right? To what extent, like, is Racine, Oshkosh, these really cities? To what extent? Which is why I'm glad I'm not looking at that classification exclusively, because that gets even muddier, I think, than some of the rural definitions. So answering that first question about looking at teachers and who's actually on the market, and cutting behind the scene, looking at sort of the activity of folks behind the scene. Of Wisconsin's 20,000 rural teachers that are actually employed in rural schools, over half of them are actively on the market. They might not have moved, they might not have left the profession, but they're actively searching for other positions on the market. And that's in comparison to 58% for towns, 74% for city teachers, and 78% for suburban teachers that are hunting for other jobs. So if you're familiar with the Wisconsin context in the Act 10 that Governor Scott put into effect in 2011, it pretty much eviscerated the unions and put forth what people refer to as an open trade or a teacher war that goes on between districts, which I think underlies some of these numbers as teachers are vying for higher salaries, offers that they can bring back to their districts. And that's particularly true for suburban teachers where they think that their district actually has the funds to up their salary in a competitive manner. So this graph breaks down where teachers taught previously and the types, the locales that they seek out when they engage the market. So this first panel here for city, talking with Andrew, we're like, I'm a little bit nervous I'm going to fall off this podium. I'm on the edge. All right, the first graphic there for city, the first upper left panel, shows that about 25% of teachers who are currently employed in a city district seek out other positions in other city districts. They're most likely to seek out a suburban district. If you look across all the panels, the suburban is always sort of like the preferred locale, regardless of where you are. But for city teachers, their second most desired locale is other cities. If we look at suburbs, they all want to go teach in other suburbs. If we look in towns, they all want to go to the suburb, but their second most preferred locale is town. But for rural teachers, again, they prefer the suburbs, But rural is actually the least desired, the least sought out position, even amongst rural teachers. So if we can think about, one of the things Richard underscored yesterday is turnover is a huge problem, and it leads to this sort of demand for more teachers. So if we think about what's going on in cities, if cities the second most desired context for city teachers, we can think of some of that labor market to be self-fulfilling, right? You're gonna have one city teacher leave a position, but another city teacher will be available to fill it, right? So some of that turnover will be fixed, right? Because not all the folks are gonna get these suburban jobs that they're vying for as their first choice anyway. Suburbs, they're fine, we'll ignore them. Towns, right? Towns are in the same sort of situation. Most people that are in towns are looking for positions in other towns if they can't get the suburban jobs. Rural, though, doesn't have that same luxury. It doesn't seem to be any sort of like repollination of itself. It's not self-populating. So that's a problem. Next. Yeah, okay. So if we look at, again, sort of looking at the teachers that are on the market and the proportion of vacancies that they submit to rural districts, we see that the vast majority of all applicants submit very, very few applications to the rural districts. There is a little bump towards the end that these folks that we refer to as like exclusively rural, they're only applying to rural districts, but they're definitely the minority of our sample. And one of the things I wanted to highlight here, as I said, we have some missing data in this, right? Because we can't line everybody up with the DPI data. So this gives you a feeling for, there's a dotted line there, and most of the time you can't see it because it's perfectly overlaid underneath the solid line. But those are our two samples compared to each other. That gives us some confidence that they're similar. And I'll show you some more evidence that we think they're similar as well. Oh, just to go back here, if you can't see it on the bottom, for both samples, the full and the restricted sample, for both samples, the average number of applications submitted to a rural district is about 15%. The median, though, is 0. Okay, so this is the results from that model, the mathematical model that I showed earlier. And what we see here in the first column is the most restricted sample. And I put in red, the numbers aren't particularly important, but I can read them out if you need it. But the numbers in red are the ones that were statistically significant. And I'd like to draw your attention right to that top row where we see student teaching in a rural context, right? It's significant in the other models, and I can walk through the details, but what I did here, and I'm happy to do that like in detail, but the goal of doing this is to show that 0.52 coefficient or 0.68, it actually increases as I change the sample, it gets a little bit larger. But we think that seems to be fairly consistent and robust to the other elements in the model, so it probably does hold with the full sample. So having done student teaching in a rural context is incredibly important and really shapes people's tendency to apply to these rural districts. The other thing that's important to take a look at is the ethnicity variables. They're negative but insignificant initially. When the sample size gets a little bit bigger, we see African American teachers tend to be significantly averse to rural contexts, which brings up all sorts of issues about like how do we actually diversify schools in rural Wisconsin. We had interesting conversations this morning within our group about sort of the rise of Trump, the rise of Scott Walker, and this bifurcation that occurs, and people can live their entire lives isolated in these rural contexts. And I think some of what we're seeing in American politics today is a result of that lack of exposure to each other, and it kind of undermines the democratic ideal that we shoot for in education. So the takeaways from that graph is that who applies to rural districts? Largely it's these people that have taught in rural districts previously, not African American teachers. Where, I didn't show this here, but it's in the paper, right? Where you attended for your education preparation program seems to matter. The UW, University of Wisconsin, La Crosse and Stevens Point campuses, those students are more likely to teach in rural contexts. UW Milwaukee, not surprisingly, less likely to teach in a rural context, but we do have like students from Eau Claire, which is in a rural context. They're also rural averse. So where your EPP program was situated or where you went matters, which suggests that educator preparation programs, how they prepare teachers, is a potential mechanism to influence this rural staffing problem. In rural student teaching, if you did have that rural student teaching experience, it increases the number of applications you send to rural districts by 15 to 20%, which is pretty significant. If the average number of applications that you send out is 10 to 15, that means you're sending out anywhere from 2 to 4 of them now to rural districts. So the second research question, how does the size of the applicant pool in rural districts compare to that of others? So one of the variables that I said we put in here was to control for supply that might differ across contexts. So we have high supply, mid supply, and low supply. And the way we created those 3 categories was by looking at the size of the applicant pools and just dividing it into thirds. So the top third of all the positions, these were elementary school positions, early childhood, physical education, social studies. They had an average of 65 applicants per vacancy. The mid-supply was math, English language arts, science, music, theater, art, and special education, had an average of 20 applications per vacancy. In the low supply, the high demand positions, bilingual education, family and computer, consumer science, agriculture education, technology education, the vocational classes were high in there. They had an average of 8 applications per vacancy. So what we see here is that initially, in the first column, right, even without any of the control variables that I end up putting in the very first column, the only locale that stands out as significantly different in terms of the number of applications that were received is the suburban locale, kind of reflecting the descriptive statistics we saw earlier. They tend to get significantly more applications per vacancy. But the city locale and the town locales look fairly similar to the rural locales. And we can include a set of covariates in there. And once we do that, once we include, particularly for educator preparation program, how close the educator preparation program is to the district, we see that even that suburban advantage fades away. So the takeaways here, right? Only the suburban districts have notably larger applicant pool size, but that diminishes in light of the educator preparation program. Higher levels of student poverty, districts with serving students of that type tend to get fewer applications. No surprise there, that's pretty well said in the literature. If you're close to an educator preparation program, you get more applications. If you're in an educator preparation program within 40 miles, the more that are around you, you get more applications. So again, this speaks to the relationship between districts and educator preparation programs. And if we can nurture that, if we can cultivate those sort of relationships, we think we can increase the supply pool for these rural districts. So initially that question was about size, right? Does size matter? Does the size of the applicant pool matter? There's a question about quality too, which is a lot harder to tackle. So if the type of applicant, they might have the same number, but if the type of applicant to a rural schools, if they look fundamentally different than those who apply elsewhere, that's a problem. So just to scratch the surface of that, here's some descriptive statistics where the upper left panel shows average experience per vacancy, and the rural is the gray bar all the way on the right, city is on the left. Again, those are fairly similar. The upper right panel is their undergraduate grade point average. Looks fairly similar. University competitiveness, so this is using the Barron's rating, again, similar, right? And the percent that there are certified for the vacancy that they're applying to, also very similar. So initially I started this talk talking about framing this within the context of job choice theory, objective, subjective, and critical contact. I think when we talk about objective and critical contact, right? Speaking to my knowledge, there isn't a system out there isn't a state out there that provides systematic information on schools that helps teachers make informed labor market decisions. It's just not there. I do think that would improve the labor market. I think it would improve the efficiency of the labor market so we see less of this turnover. Teachers know what they're getting into. Critical contact, I think we saw the coefficients up there on educator preparation program and student teaching, which we know comes from the educator preparation program. So I think that's an element of critical contact. It's a way for a teacher to interact with the school, to interact with the principal, their potential colleagues at a school in a way that they didn't have access to previously. So I think when we think about developing networks, we want to think about how do we extend that critical contact? How do we get rural districts in contact with educator preparation programs so they can kind of fuel that pipeline. So where do we go from here? All right, so overall takeaways, locale matters to teachers on the labor market. Teachers do appear to be averse to rural contexts. That's again something that I think we can hit with educator preparation programs. Why are they rural averse? Are these things that have to do with living in a rural context, which has its own set of limitations? Ed and I were talking this morning about the limited housing options that are available in rural communities, right? These things a little bit beyond the control of the school. Or are these pedagogical and instructional challenges, like the fact that rural teachers tend to have to teach multiple subjects or multiple grades, which is difficult, especially for novice teachers to undertake, but is a reality in many rural contexts. I think there's a state role for targeted funding for the recruitment of locales to high poverty or remote locales. Right now in Wisconsin, most states that I'm aware of, they tend not to have targeted recruitment for rural schools to increase funding in those areas. Rural schools tend to have lower pay. Again, what do we need to do to try to attract teachers to that area? And I think the state has a role to play there as well. The state can think about what is the state role for supporting student teaching experiences. One of the reasons we don't see so many student teaching experiences as we go further away from the educator preparation programs is because of the supervisory component of the student teaching experience. It's hard to get the educator preparation program to hire a supervisor that can go 40, 50, 100 miles away from their educator preparation program to service all of these rural, potentially rural student teaching experiences. So how do we think about job sharing with the local education agencies? What we have is CESAs, the collective groups of districts that kind of tend to share resources. Could another school take over that responsibility? Could they hire a veteran teacher to be the supervisor for that particular student, right? Thinking about ways that we can stretch the distance of these rural teaching, student teaching experiences to extend deeper into the rural context. One of the things we encounter in Wisconsin is that prior to Act 10, everybody talks about, and this is anecdotal, I don't actually have data on this, but the superintendents I've talked to talk about having a glut of applicants pretty much all over, right? And the real challenge that they had is what's the selection process? How do I cut through all these applicants? How do I find the best one, right? That's not the world they live in anymore, right? The applications have plummeted. We've seen that the number of applicants in teacher education programs has plummeted. The Title II data says that the graduates from educator preparation programs is plummeted. We just have less teachers on the market. To Richard's point yesterday, we still have an excess of teachers. We just don't have as much as we used to have. And what this means for what this means for schools, particularly rural schools, is they have to extend beyond themselves when they think about the labor market. How do I actively recruit teachers? How do I brand myself as a place that people want to teach in? Part of that is exceptional leadership. Teachers talk to each other. They get a feel for where are the amazing places to work and who are the amazing principals to work for, right? That's passive. In my opinion, I think principals need to take a more active role in stretching out and reaching these their potential applicants. We also see that the school and local district leaders in remote districts have to network and narrow the distance. So that's sort of a reiteration of what I just said. And we see that diversifying rural faculty remains problematic. As I was sharing with our working group, I have a colleague that said she would never work in a rural district as an African American woman, and Wisconsin's pretty racist. When you get out there, there's microaggressions, but there's pretty sizable macroaggressions as well. And she said even putting all of that to the side, she's like, I couldn't live somewhere where I have to drive 2 hours to get my hair done because nobody around there can do that. Like, those are some of the realities of attracting people of color to a particular context. Even considering all the tokenism that occurs and the marginalization that happens. There's real issues about diversifying faculty, especially in a place like Wisconsin. Now, in a place like Mississippi that has a very different demographic for its rural population, right, that might not be an issue. But for a lot of the states in the north, their rural districts are just incredibly white and incredibly remote, which can be incredibly isolating. So I had some questions. This is some thoughts that I have for you to leave you with. Right? Are rural districts viewed as safety picks by the best applicants? One huge limitation in this data is I look at the people that apply. Right? I don't actually see who was given an interview, who accepted the interview, who was given an offer, who accepted the offer. Those are critical pieces of this puzzle. So if people are just applying to these rural districts as sort of a backup, as a safety, they don't, with very little intention of actually going there, their applicant pools are going to look similar as we saw, but it's not similar in practice. Right? So extending the data on interview and hiring, I think, is important. Maybe doing some qualitative work to get in there, talk about our principals continually making offers to what they think is their best candidates, only to find that their best candidates are leaving and taking offers elsewhere. I'd like to know what strategies are successful in rural districts to recruit talent. How, like rural districts that do have higher applicant pools, different, more qualified applicant pools, what are they doing? How are they networking? How are they branding themselves? How can policy and research help school leaders seal the deal? So I preface this research with saying that a school leader can't hire somebody who's not in their applicant pool. But once they are in the applicant pool, I think even if they're in there as a safety application, a safety pick, school leaders then have the opportunity to reach out to that person to convince them that their school is really the place where that's right for that teacher and where they want to be. So how does policy research help school leaders do that? These are the last four sort of more methodological questions, but I was very curious if the number of applications is the right metric for the first research question. Somebody said it should be if somebody applied to a rural district at all, make it binary. Yes, did they apply to at least one rural district, or did they apply to none? Open to thinking about that. I controlled for the number of applications because it seemed to me if you're just applying for a ton of applications, you're flooding the market, you're going to have a higher likelihood of applying to a rural district as a fluke. Somebody said that was a demand side, that it was too closely related to my outcome and shouldn't be there. So be interested in your thoughts there. As I mentioned, the NCES codes also have, I can break rural down further into fringe, distant, and remote. And so looking at heterogeneity, even within the rural districts, are there differences in the size and quality of the applicant pool there? And then potentially interacting locale with the educator preparation variables to see if being closer to an educator preparation program is significantly different for a rural location than it is for a suburban or town or city, something like that. So those are the questions that I have, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Thanks. It's generally their cumulative their final formal placement, but that's a good point. So they actually list on their application where they did their student teaching. So that's the information that we use. And to my recollection, people only list one, even though they might have had like clinical field observations maybe at different places. That's a great point to get that critical contact. It doesn't have to be a formal student teaching experience.
I think it would be very interesting to see the seal of the deal. Just from my anecdotal, being married to a principal who works in a rural area, you have people who apply, but then they don't take the position. And I know with looking at higher education, they do how many people apply, how many pay for application, and look at that attrition, because the numbers totally change till that part of they move there and take a job. So I think that would be very telling.
I would love to have that data.
So I would love for you to do it too.
I think we've been working with Weekend, and they're very grassroots. They're an HR organization, and as such, they're incredibly aware of the legal implications of what they do, and they're very reluctant to sort of extend beyond that with they're just nervous. But I think to push into that world, which I think is really important, I'd have to create some relationship with specific districts and say, walk me through this process for your district. I know these people applied, who did you interview, and so forth. But it can be done.
Could you speak to, again, how you collected your samples in terms of, I think I heard you reference state level or district level, and that could be not necessarily to a school, and then how you track an applicant that might have just applied to 5 counties in the area, right? So I mean, how you collected that data?
Sure. So the data is collected through the Wisconsin Education Career Access Network, the WECAN system, which is a system where districts buy a membership to the WECAN system, and then they're allowed to post vacancies. And then teachers can log on to the system, create a profile, and they can search through the vacancies and then apply to them individually. So I collected all of that information, and that's the information that I merged with the DPI data.
But that's secondary to, if their normal practices, a school district might have their own application system that may not have gone through the WECAN.
Right.
Okay.
It's anecdotally talking with, like I work pretty closely with WASPA, which is the Wisconsin Association of School Personnel Administrators, who oversees the WECAN system. In most of the districts, the vast majority of the districts who participate in WECAN, like that is their HR system. Partially because they're, especially the small rural districts, that tends to be the case.
I was puzzled by one of your early data slides that, if I understood it correctly, seemed to show that teachers in rural schools were less likely to apply and try to move than in other places. And that seems to go against the grain, that somehow the teachers in rural schools are less likely to want to get out. And it also seems to contradict that data point I showed yesterday. Well, for the high poverty rural schools is the highest teacher turnover nationally. So am I misunderstanding? I mean, or what about that early slide?
Sure, I don't think you're misunderstanding. I think there's a couple things going on, and I could probably clarify that with additional data. I think it would be nice to actually put, that's the number of people that apply, but how many people actually move? So as I mentioned, the folks in suburban districts, my feel is that a lot of those folks are applying to other positions, hunting for other offers that they can either accept if they're better or take back to their home district. So sort of like feeling out the waters. So I think their commitment to move is different. My feel is that the folks in rural schools, they might be engaged at a lower rate, but they're more committed to like, I'm going to move. I'm going to take one of these applications that I put out. And the applications that they put out tend to be in non-rural areas.
Although you'd think that if you can get an offer, you might get your salary bumped. I'm wondering, why wouldn't rural teachers also want to get their, sort of playing that game to get your salary bumped? Why would rural teachers do that less?
Because their administrations are often operating with fewer resources. And so within Wisconsin, there's 2 main reasons why they wouldn't meet an offer. One is because they're salary strapped, so they're liquidity constrained, right? It's going to happen, especially in the rural districts that have declining enrollment, right? That becomes a real problem, so they can't match it. There's also, as I was sharing with some folks earlier, there's a lot of districts in Wisconsin, after the unions were dissolved, they still hold the union line, and they say, from a principled standpoint, we will not give higher offers. Like, you're a math teacher, you get paid what all of our teachers get, and I'm not going to play that game. Which I don't think is good for teachers overall, and I think it artificially suppresses the wages of teachers, which the market says should be higher. But I think those 2 things are both there.
Are there incentives in place in these rural districts and areas to recruit teachers from elsewhere?
They're not formally part of the system. I know Madison, for example, tries to work with Arizona State University to try to bring bilingual teachers up and place them, but they tend to be district specific and not particularly robust.